Lord Martin REES. It's a great honor for me to be able to present and introduce him today. I want to thank Mr. Tisdale and EPRS for organizing the ESPAS. It has been a great honor for me to participate the last years and basically giving us an overview of what's happening globally, the global trends. I think chairing the Science and Technology panel of the European Parliament, I understand we have to not just give options to politicians, but to be able to kind of predict the future and also predict the impact and predict how we can prepare our children for works and jobs that don't even exist. Recently, a friend of mine told me that his daughter wanted to become an YouTuber and influencer. I realized these are jobs that they never thought existed, and yet they exist. So, an engineer myself, I love mathematics, I love solving problems, and I come from Greece, so plenty of problems to solve. But also I come from a country with a great history, and exceptional philosophers, and a place where democracy was born. So I had the chance when I arrived to the European Parliament to work with scientists, thinkers, Nobel Prize winners, and realize that the global challenges have more problems for me to solve and try to predict and maybe try to influence a bit the policies. So we realize also that we need global solutions, but also in a local level to decentralize things. We see that exponential technology is radically transforming our world, and artificial intelligence, blockchain, peer-to-peer sharing of value will have to make us rethink the world as we know it. There is a challenge of energy, climate change, the demographics. Lord REES comes from UK, so he understands the impact that migration or demographics could have into the choices that people make, or the fear of the world for the future, and how the technology can disrupt the world as we know it. So we cannot remain irrelevant. We have to be able to discuss with people that have a bigger picture of what's happening in this world, and also be able to give us hope. So himself, he's an astrophysicist, a cosmologist, but as I said, we both love mathematics, and I think this is where it comes from, our effort to understand the world and the future. He has studied, he had a progressive education at his parents' college, the Bedstone College, and then at the Trinity College of Cambridge, which I think is amazing. You have to at least visit. I visited and I was so jealous. And I know that he has so many awards. I don't know which are the more important ones, but I would like to mention some, if you don't mind. So we have the prize, the gold medal of the Royal Astronomical Society, Bauer Award, the Gruber Prize in Cosmology, the Albert Einstein World Award of Science, the Order of Merit, Templeton Prize, Isaac Newton Medal, and more awards that you can read everywhere. And also he's a person that, besides, so he's in UK, he was a Remainer of Scotland in UK, I believe a Remainer for UK to Europe. And of course, somebody that you cannot mislead. He's the one who explained optical illusions in the universe of superluminal astronomical observations. He understands the black holes and extraterrestrial intelligence. And BBC chose him for exceptional lectures that you can all find and have more time to enjoy his speeches. So we are lucky enough to have him with us. I will give him the floor. It's a great honor to have you here, and thank you for your work. And I do hope you can give us some hope that we can actually control the future.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you very much for those kind words. It's a privilege to be here, although an embarrassment to be here as a Brit in this particular week. I apologize for that. I'm going to try to set the backdrop for later discussions today by looking forward several decades. And if I'm allowed an advertisement, this is a book I published last month, which expands on some of the things I'm going to say. My main theme is that this century is special. The Earth has existed for 45 million centuries. But this is the first when one species, the human species, has the planet's future in its hands. We're deep in the Anthropocene. We could irreversibly degrade the biosphere, or misdirected technology could cause a catastrophic setback to civilization. We need to avoid both those and aim, of course, for sustainability and greater equality. Bio, cyber, and robotics and space are all technologies that offer huge potential benefits, but they also expose us to new vulnerabilities. And I'll address these in the second part of my talk, though they're hard to predict even 20 years ahead. But before I do that, let me focus on two things which we can predict, even with a cloudy crystal ball, several decades ahead. The first is that the world is getting more crowded. This distorted map shows the growth in the world population over the last 30 years and where it's happened, mainly in East Asia and in Africa. World population has doubled in the last 50 years. It's now 7.7 billion. The number of births per year worldwide actually peaked a few years ago and is going down. Nonetheless, world population is projected to rise to around 9 billion by 2050. And that's partly because most people in the developing world are young. Compare the left and right sides there of those histograms. And the young people in West Africa, they will have their 2 children and they live longer. So the age histogram on the left will become more like that on the right. I won't say more on this. Hans Rosling's presentations on this subject, I'm sure you've seen, are far, far better than anything I could do. To feed 9 billion people by mid-century, we'll need improved agriculture, low-till, water conserving, and perhaps GM crops. And maybe dietary innovations, converting insects, highly nutritious and rich in proteins, into palatable food, and making artificial meat. To quote Gandhi, there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. So food production shouldn't be a showstopper. But just one concern. By mid-century, Africa will have 5 times Europe's population. Lagos and Cairo will have populations exceeding 30 or 40 million. And if families in Africa remain large, then according to the UN projections, that continent's population could double again by 2100 to 4 billion. Nigeria alone would then have as big a population as Europe and North America combined. Well, optimists say that each extra mouth brings also 2 hands and a brain. But it's the geopolitical stresses that are really worrying. As compared to the fatalism of earlier generations, those in poor countries now know, via the internet, etc., what they're missing. Moreover, migration is easier. But the advent of robots and reshoring of manufacturing means that the still poor countries won't be able to grow their economies by offering cheap, skilled labor, as the Asian tigers did. This is the recipe for disaffection and instability and multiple mega versions of the tragic boat people crossing the Mediterranean today. So wealthy nations should surely urgently promote growing prosperity in Africa, and not just for altruistic reasons. And another thing. if humanity's collective impact on land use and climate pushes too hard, the resultant ecological shock could cause mass extinctions. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it. Already there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Biodiversity is a crucial component of human well-being. We're clearly harmed if fish stocks dwindle to extinction. There are plants in the rainforest whose gene pool might be useful to us. But for many environmentalists, preserving the richness of our biosphere has value over and above what it means to us humans. To quote the great ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. So the world's getting more crowded. And the second firm prediction, it'll gradually get warmer. In contrast to population issues, climate change is not under-discussed, though it is under-acted upon. The clear basis is that the carbon dioxide concentration is rising steadily. It's risen by 50% since pre-industrial times, and the fifth IPCC report presented a spread of projections for the mean temperature rise this century for different assumptions about future rates of fossil fuel use, etc. There's still an uncertainty in the science. It's still unclear how much the climatic effects of CO2 directly are amplified by associated changes in water vapor and clouds. And that's a further uncertainty indicated by the bars on the right-hand side of that slide. However, despite the uncertainties, there are two messages that most people would agree on. First, regional disruptions to weather patterns in the next 20 or 30 years will aggravate pressures on food and water, enhance migration pressures, and enhance extreme weather. Secondly, under business as usual scenarios, we can't rule out later this century really catastrophic warming and tipping points triggering long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's ice cap. But even those who accept both those statements don't agree on the policy response. And the divergences stem from differences in economics and in ethics, in particular in how much obligation we should feel towards future generations. You probably have heard of Born Lomborg, who has sort of bogeyman status among environmentalists, and his Copenhagen Consensus of Economists downplays the priority of addressing climate change in comparison with shorter-term efforts to help the world's poor. But that's because he applies a standard discount rate, 5%, and in effect, therefore, writes off what happens beyond 2050. But if you care about those who will live into the 22nd century and beyond, then, as economists like Stern and Weitzman argue, you will deem it worth paying an insurance premium now to protect those generations against the worst-case scenario. So even those who agree that there's a significant risk of climate catastrophe, a century hence, they'll differ in how urgently they advocate action today. Their assessment will depend on expectations of future growth, optimism about technological fixes, but above all, it depends on an ethical issue. In optimizing people's life chances, should we discriminate on grounds of date of birth? As a parenthesis, I'd note that there's one policy context where an essentially zero discount rate is applied, and that's to radioactive waste disposal, when the depositories are required to prevent leakage for at least 10,000 years. Somewhat ironic when we can't plan the rest of energy policy even 30 years ahead. What will actually happen on the climate policy front? The pledges made at Paris in 2015 are a positive step. But politicians won't gain much resonance by advocating unwelcome lifestyle changes now or a high carbon tax, when the benefits accrue mainly to distant parts of the world and are decades in the future. And as Jean-Claude Juncker said in a different context, we know what to do, but we don't know how to get re-elected if we do it. But there is one win-win roadmap to a low-carbon future. Cleaner energy sources. Nations should accelerate their research and development into all forms of low-carbon energy generation and into other technologies where parallel progress is crucial, especially storage, batteries, pump storage, etc., and into smart grids. The faster these clean technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so they become affordable to, for instance, India, where more generating capacity will be needed and where the health of the poor is now jeopardized by smoky stoves burning wood and dung, and where there will otherwise be pressure to build coal-fired power stations. Sun and wind are, of course, the front runners, but other methods have geographical niches. Geothermal power, for instance, in Iceland, and harnessing tidal energy seems attractive where the topography induces large amplitude tides. Britain's west coast is one such place, and there are proposals for barrages and lagoons. But because of intermittency in solar and wind, we'll need continental-scale DC grids. In Europe, carrying solar energy from Morocco and Spain to the less sunny northern Europe, and east-west to smooth peak demand over different time zones in North America and Eurasia, and perhaps all the way along the Belt and Road to China. And despite wide ambivalence about nuclear energy, it's surely worthwhile to boost R&D into a variety of fourth-generation concepts, which could prove to be more flexible in size and safer. And the potential payoff from fusion is so great that it's surely worth continuing experiments and prototypes. It would be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than devising clean and economical energy systems for the world. Let me turn now to other technologies. We should be evangelists for new technologies, not Luddites. Without them, the world can't provide food and sustainable energy for an expanding and more demanding population. But we need wisely directed technology. Indeed, many of us are anxious that it's advancing so fast that we may not properly cope with it, and that we'll have a bumpy ride through this century. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics offer prospects of containing pandemics. But the same research has controversial aspects. For instance, in 2012, groups in Wisconsin and in Holland showed it was surprisingly easy to make the influenza virus both more virulent and more transmissible. To some, this was a scary portent of things to come. And in 2014, the US federal government decided to cease funding these so-called gain-of-function experiments. The new CRISPR-Cas9 technique for gene editing is hugely promising, but there are ethical concerns. We've heard just this week about Chinese experiments on this. And there are worries about possible runaway consequences of gene drive programs to wipe out species. Mosquitoes that carry the Zika virus, and in my country to wipe out the gray squirrel, which is regarded as a pest. The EU has traditionally taken a very stringent, precautionary attitude to biotech. But I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws can. I worry that whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that's a nightmare. Whereas an atomic bomb can't be built without large-scale special-purpose facilities, biotech involves small-scale, dual-use equipment. Indeed, biohacking is burgeoning even as a hobby and competitive game. The global village will have its village idiots, but they'll have global range. The rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups, or even individuals, by bio as well as cyber technology, will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tensions between freedom, privacy, and security. A big challenge to government. And another point I should have mentioned is that society is becoming more brittle and fragile. I mentioned pandemics, but these will cause far more societal breakdown than in earlier centuries. English villages in the 14th century continued to function even when the Black Death halved their populations. The rest went on fatalistically. In contrast, our societies were vulnerable to serious unrest as soon as hospitals were overwhelmed, and that would occur before the fatality rate even approached 1%. That's a real extra challenge to governance. These concerns are fairly near term, within 10 or 15 years. What about looking further ahead? There are deeper imponderables here. The smartphone, the web, and their ancillaries would have seemed magic even just 25 years ago. So looking towards 2050, we must keep our minds open, or at least ajar, to transformative advances that may now seem science fiction. On the bio front, we might then expect two things. First, a better understanding of the combination of genes that determine key human characteristics. And secondly, the ability to synthesize genomes that match those features. And if it becomes possible to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, then our ecology and even our species may not survive for long unscathed. And what about another transformative technology? Robotics and artificial intelligence, AI. Machine learning is a potentially stupendous breakthrough. It allows machines to gain expertise very quickly. You'll have heard about the machine that learned to play Go within a few hours, well enough to beat a world champion. It allows also machines to recognize faces, translate between languages, and so on, without being programmed in detail. Moreover, AI is still just at the baby stage compared to what its proponents expect in coming decades. Already, it can cope with complex, fast-changing networks, traffic flows, or electric grids. It could enable a Chinese to gather and process all the information needed to run an efficient, planned economy that Marx could only have dreamt of. And in science, its capacity to explore zillions of options could allow it to find recipes for better drugs or for a material that conducts electricity with zero resistance at room temperature. It's, of course, the speed of computers which allows them to succeed by brute force methods. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way babies learn. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of multilingual text. Here, they're given EU documents because their boredom threshold is infinite. The implications for our society are already ambivalent. If there's a bug in the software of an AI system, it's not always possible to track it down. And this is likely to create public concern if the system's decisions have grave consequences for individuals. If we are sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for surgery, or even given a poor credit rating, we'd expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. If such decisions were entirely delegated to an algorithm, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if presented with compelling evidence that on average the machines make better decisions than humans do. AI systems will become more intrusive and pervasive. Records of all our movements, our health, our financial transactions will be in the cloud, managed by a multinational quasi-monopoly. The data may be used for benign reasons, for instance, medical research, or to warn us of incipient health risks. But its availability to internet companies is already shifting the balance of power from governments towards global conglomerates. And there are other privacy concerns. Are you happy if a random stranger sitting opposite you in the train can, via facial recognition, identify you and invade your privacy? Or if fake videos of you become so convincing that visual evidence can no longer be trusted? The academic and commercial experts now speak with one voice in highlighting the need to promote robust and beneficial AI. But tensions may emerge when AI moves from the research and development phase to being a potentially massive money spinner for global companies. And these experts think that the AI field, like synthetic biology, already needs guidelines for responsible innovation. Moreover, the fact that the AlphaGo machine achieved a goal that its creators thought would have taken several more years has rendered the DeepMind staff, who I know quite well, even more bullish about the speed of advancement. But there are others, like the roboticist Rodney Brooks, creator of the Baxter robot and the Roomba vacuum cleaner, who are skeptical. Be that as it may, it's crucial to be aware of the potential of advanced artificial intelligence, even though we may worry more about the impacts of real stupidity for many decades longer. And robots still are rather clumsy in dealing with the real world. Boston Dynamics has made this robot called Handle that can do somersaults, but they've got a long way to go. And of course, the incipient shifts in the nature of work have been addressed in several excellent books by economists and social scientists. Clearly, machines will take over much of the work of manufacturing and retail distribution. They can replace many white-collar jobs, routine legal work, accountancy, computer coding, medical diagnostics, even surgery. Many professionals will find their hard-earned skills in less demand. In contrast, some skilled service sector jobs, plumbing and gardening, for instance, will be among the hardest jobs to automate. The digital revolution generates enormous wealth for an elite and for global companies. But preserving a healthy society will surely require redistribution of that wealth. There's talk of using it to provide a universal income, but it's surely better when all who are capable of it can perform socially useful work rather than get a handout. And indeed, to create a humane society, governments should surely enhance the number and status of those who care for the old, the young and the sick. There are currently far too few, and they're poorly paid, inadequately esteemed, and insecure in their positions. Moreover, we're going to a stage when there's another thing that may happen, and that's life extension. This would be a real game changer. And it's also possibly on the cards that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may become malleable through a combination of genetic modification and cyborg technology. And this is a game changer. When we require the literature, we admire the literature and the artifacts which have survived from ancient Greece, we feel an affinity across a gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their civilizations. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have an algorithmic understanding of how we behaved. Well, going back closer to the present, It's likely that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on how fast this will happen and whether they'll be idiot savants or display superhuman capabilities. And now I turn to another technology, space. This is where robots surely have a future, and where I'll argue that the changes will happen fastest and should worry us less. We depend every day on space for sat-nav, environmental monitoring, communication, and so forth. Europe has a strong aerospace industry. ESA is fully a match for NASA in space science. During this century, the whole solar system will be explored by swarms of miniaturized probes, far more advanced than the marvelous Cassini, which explores Saturn for 30 years, the European probe that went to the comet Rosetta, and the American probe that sent back pictures of Pluto 20,000 times further away than the moon. All those were 1990s technology. When we think of the progress, we realize how much better we could do in space exploration using the advances now incorporated in every smartphone. The next step will be deployment in space of robotic fabricators, which can build large structures, for instance, giant telescopes with huge gossamer thin mirrors assembled under zero gravity. What about manned spaceflight? The high point of that was the Apollo landing nearly 50 years ago. I treasure this picture signed for me by some of the astronauts. But if I were an American, I wouldn't support NASA's manned program. And I certainly wouldn't support a manned program done by ESA. I'd argue that private enterprise ventures should front all manned missions. That's because they can accept higher risks. If we send a civilian into space, we've got to ensure that it's very safe. Whereas the private enterprise companies can cut costs and launch into space volunteers prepared to accept high risks, even one-way tickets, driven by the same motives as early explorers, mountaineers, and the like. So by 2100, courageous thrill seekers may have established bases on Mars. And Elon Musk, he's age 47, says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. Yes. But don't ever expect mass emigration from the Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. And here I disagree with Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking. It's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change on Earth is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. So, in conclusion, let me come back close to the here and now. My book emphasizes how our society is brittle, interconnected, and vulnerable. And we fret unduly about small risks: air crashes, carcinogens in food, low radiation doses, etc. But we are in denial about some newly emergent threats which could be globally devastating. Some of these are environmental, the pressures of a growing and more demanding population. Others are the potential downsides of powerful new technology. And the wise mantra is that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. So, how can scientists concerned about these issues influence policymakers? And incidentally, in talking about science, I include technology and engineering. Indeed, the latter have the more challenging task. My engineering friends like a cartoon which shows two beavers looking up at a vast hydroelectric dam. One beaver says to the other, "I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea." And armchair theorists like me should be very modest compared to those who actually build things that work and meet public demand. The trouble is that even the best politicians focus mainly on the urgent and parochial and getting re-elected. And this is an endemic frustration for those, and I know many, who've been official science advisors to government. To attract politicians' attention, you must get headlined in the press, and fill their inboxes. So scientists can have more leverage indirectly by campaigning so that the public and the media amplify their voice. They can engage by involvement with NGOs, via blogging and journalism, and of course through political activity. Let me give two recent instances. I'm in the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and the scientists there had a conference in 2014 that provided input to the papal encyclical Laudato Si', which had a worldwide influence in the lead-up to the Paris Climate Conference in 2015. There's no gainsaying the Church's global reach, long-term vision, and concern for the world's poor. And that helped, at least transiently, to raise public awareness of the climate issue. And to take another slightly more parochial example, in the UK, there's now proposed legislation to prohibit non-reusable plastics in drinking straws and such like. Our minister, Michael Gove, wouldn't have become so exercised about non-degradable plastic waste had it not been for the public impact of BBC's Planet 2 series, fronted by David Attenborough, especially the images of albatrosses returning to their nests and regurgitating plastic debris rather than the food intended for their young in the nest. That's an iconic image, just as the polar bear on the melting ice floe has been for climate change. Universities have a special role, partly because they're full of young people who live to the end of a century, and partly because they can use their staff's expertise and convening power to address these problems. Academics owe it to their fellow citizens to maximize the benefits of their discoveries and minimize the downsides. They're also well placed to assess which of these scary scenarios can be dismissed as science fiction and how best to avoid the serious ones. And they should do this internationally, because science is a universal culture spanning all nations and faiths. And of course, most of the challenges I've addressed are global. Coping with potential shortages of food, water resources, and transitioning to low-carbon energy can't be solved by each nation separately, nor can threat reduction. And indeed, I think a key issue for us here is whether nations need to give up more sovereignty to new organizations along the lines of the IAEA, WHO, etc. But though we may be political pessimists, we must remain techno-optimists. Advances in AI, biotech, nanotech, and space can boost the developing as well as the developed world. Undiluted application of the precautionary principle has a manifest downside. We're all on this crowded world together. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable to disruption and breakdowns. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning, too little long-term thinking. We need to think globally, we need to think rationally, we need to think long-term, empowered by 21st century technology, but guided by values that science itself can't provide. And finally, I give the last word to the great biologist Peter Medawar, who said, "The troubles that beset mankind are like the bells of alpine cattle. They're attached to our own neck. And it must be our fault if they don't make a tuneful and melodious sound." Thank you very much.
Okay, I think an award of a brilliant speaker is remained to be given to you. And in the European Parliament, this is really important. Thank you for your speech. It was really brilliant. And I will take very quick some questions for you, if you don't mind. Thank you. Do we have questions?
Thank you very much. Heather Graby from Open Society. Thank you. This is amazingly inspiring, despite the incredibly bad news about what the planet is going to be like within our own lifetimes, not only for our children and grandchildren. I would like to ask you about how we can ensure that politicians and policymakers take much more account of the long-term and global view that science provides. At the moment, the input of science is there in many levels of policy, but it doesn't seem to be there in political debates. The most famous quotation, perhaps about expertise in the past year, is, "We've had enough of experts." So how do we make experts sexy again, and how do we get politicians to pay attention to them? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have, yes, another one. Please present yourself.
Hello, my name's David Price. I'm a writer and a historian of Schumann. I started as a theoretical physicist, and I was struck by the fact that Schumann said that the supranational community idea, which has given us 70 years of peace, was a scientific experiment. He was at the University of Berlin in the first decades of 1900, but in 1914, the four famous scientists supported the idea of supranational community: Einstein and the professor of astronomy in Berlin, Förster, Nikolai, who had studied with Pavlov, and Buick, who was a natural philosopher of Faraday. But they made a declaration in 1914 about the First World War. But my question in reaction to the great address we've just had is that even though they made this declaration, they only had 4 people who signed it. And what is more important than declarations and even scientists saying things is the example. We have the example now of the European community system, but it's not working according to Schumann. Can I just give the question, which is the number of things which Schumann said should happen, which is open democracy. We should have open councils. We should have a European Parliament which is elected on a European basis. We should have consultative committees which are also elected, which give industry, consumers, and labor their voice, and regions, and we've had this. So how do we deal with the internal problems of Europe as the living example to the world?
He wants to answer already, yes.
Well, I mean, I entirely share your sentiments, but if I could answer 2 questions regarding the concern about the long term. I mean, I did mention this a bit in my remarks, and it is very, very hard to persuade politicians to focus on long term when they clearly have immediate worries between now and the next election, etc. I do think that it will only happen if there is public pressure, because they care about their inboxes, they care about the press. And that's why I thought the Pope's intervention in 2015 was very important. I think if you look back over all the great movements, anti-slavery, black power in the United States, gay rights, etc., all these started with a few charismatic figures, and then they gained public support. And then the politicians took them on board. I think these long-term issues have to develop that kind of way. There's a lovely statement by the great anthropologist Margaret Mead, who says, "It takes only a few determined people to change the world. Indeed, nothing else ever has." And I think that's a very important thing, because it does need a few people to be leaders and to transform opinion. Could I say one other thing about science, going back to the second question, that clearly scientists have a special responsibility, and of course the scientists who worked at Los Alamos went back to civilian life, but they felt a long-time obligation to promote efforts to harness the powers that helped unleash. And I knew in their old age people like Joe Rotblat and Hans Bethe, great men, and they were really committed. They're a model for what we need for concerned scientists in these areas of AI and biotech today. But of course, the public, to really exert pressure, needs to be at least basically informed about science. They need to understand enough science to participate in a debate on energy, environment, or health, which are big issues for all politicians. So they needn't be experts, but they need to know a bit more than they do now. But I'm not the kind of scientist who bemoans the ignorance that people have of science. It's amazing how many people are interested in dinosaurs, the Higgs boson, and entirely irrelevant things like that. They are interested in science, and it's just as bad if people don't know the history of their own country and can't find South Korea or Syria on a map. And there are many people in all our countries who can't do that. So basic education is necessary for an informed democracy, and science is going to be a bigger aspect of that if we are going to maintain long-term concerns about these issues where technology is a risk but also is the way of solutions.
Thank you for that. I wish we had more politicians than me here. I hope we do. I'll take 2-3 more questions.
I thought it was very interesting and to hear that you ended on this note that the science is a dawdle and it's the politics and the societal issues we need to really ponder about, because when I speak to scientists in general, what they say is, in a way, the public sees scientists as our salvation in terms of the future, but we can buy us time, perhaps, we can make things better at the margins, but we need to fundamentally think of these things as societal issues that everyone needs to grapple with. And one thing I wanted to ask your opinion on in particular is what you think of initiatives to think about what form of relationship we want between economics, the economic sphere, and society, particularly in terms of arguments to shift towards secular forms of economy, where we're trying to eradicate waste from our systems, whether it's from programmed obsolescence to the decision to do away with plastic bags, potentially, one-time use plastic bags. We see it also, I think, at the grassroots level, that a lot of people are interested, maybe they don't formulate it in that way, but they talk of things like transitions, which I think go into that idea of making our economy circular and maybe rethinking this concept of growth, which is a linear process, which demands constant, progress, but progress, as we know, is also destructive. So can we think more of ways in which we can reframe more the ties between economics and society, more in terms of transformation and the capacity of our societies to transform as a sign of their health more than their capacity to constantly produce more growth?
Thank you. One more, yes.
My name is Henry Artaka from the Robert Bosch Foundation. One of the many things that struck me in your presentation was this comparison that you gave between the English village that survived 50% population loss and the 1% hospital overcrowdedness nowadays. I wonder if you had a couple of other ideas on where to look in the grand scheme of things into human past, on how societies were more resilient to disruptive elements that came along their way. Thank you.
And yes, please.
Thank you. Josh Polcher, I work for the OECD Strategic Foresight team. I just want to pick up on something that you implied in your very interesting talk when you said figuring out which scenarios or which future ideas are science fiction and therefore can be dismissed. Harari says that if you hear a scenario about 2050 and it sounds like science fiction, it's probably incorrect. But if it doesn't sound like science fiction, then it's definitely incorrect. So how do we know which futures we can really safely dismiss?
And if I can just add one thing that's always of my concern. So, because we're politicians, we have a lot of things to take from your speech. And I wanted to ask, well, because I see also the final slide, like live forever, and we did listen yesterday of this Chinese experiment of having babies that are immune to diseases, some diseases with CRISPR that you mentioned, and the technology is exponential, so it's not easy to, because you talked about values and ethics that I don't know if we can actually define, because I don't know if you wanted your baby to have, to be immune or not. So this is a question not for us to respond to. We have to give options, I think, to citizens. But I wanted to ask something more existential. Do you believe there is something more than our existence? Is there something beyond? And I ask because we talk about the spirit in ancient Greek philosophy, and now we try to copy people, you know, we do believe that it's an algorithmic result on our DNA. Is it? Can we exist without spirit?
Well, very short answers to 4 very deep questions. First, on the question of waste and a circular economy, clearly a lot more can be done. I mean, for instance, there's a professor in Cambridge who's discussing how if a building's demolished, then the girders and the plastic piping is undegraded and can be reused. You can do things like that. You can minimize the costs. And also, I think one can persuade the public to be less wasteful. I mean, you can make it naff rather than stylish to drive what we in England call a Chelsea tractor in London, or to have patio heaters and all that. So just as attitudes to drunk driving and things have changed, then I think there is some hope of public attitudes. Leading on to the question about economic growth, I think we need to be too pessimistic, because economic growth doesn't imply greater consumption of raw materials. I mean, for instance, the growing miniaturization over the last 20 years of all electronics has been beneficial. It's economic growth in a real sense, but it doesn't consume more resources. So I think we needn't be anti-growth if we are anti-excessive consumption. So there's not a really severe dilemma on that sense. Yes. Yes, and the other question was about social concerns, about the 1%, etc. I do worry that we are more fragile, in that public disorder would arise if people's expectations weren't fulfilled. I think if the electricity grid on the east coast of the United States went down for more than a week or so, there'd be complete chaos. So we have to worry about those things. And the other thing that's different is that any disaster will cascade globally. Some of you may know a book by Jared Darman called Collapse, where he talks about 5 societies that collapsed. But of course, those were limited at least to one continent. Whereas I think, given the interconnectedness of our finance system, just-in-time delivery system, and our media, and that panic and rumor spread at the speed of light, then I think any really severe setback will cascade to all continents. I think that's a serious worry. Turning now to your question, it's too deep really to be answered, but let me just say one thing. I think the more one does of science, the more one is aware of the wonder and mystery, because as the frontiers advance, more new questions are posed that we couldn't even have been posed before. And another thing which is perhaps a special perspective I bring as an astronomer is an awareness of the long-term future. I mean, I think unless you live in Kentucky or parts of the Muslim world, you're happy with the idea that we are the result of 4 billion years or so of Darwinian evolution on this earth. But many people who believe that nonetheless somehow think that we humans are the culmination of it all. No astronomer could believe that, because we know that our sun is less than halfway through its life, and our expanding universe may go on forever. And to quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So we are maybe not even at the halfway stage. And I discuss in my book the idea that perhaps this century, especially in another way, it will see a transition from Darwinian selection to, in fact, secular intelligent design, the way in which future evolution will be led by technology. It may be genetic. More likely, I think, it will be that electronic engines will take over. And indeed, the pioneers on Mars, I think, will be the lead of this, because they find themselves on Mars, away from all the regulations, and in an environment where they're poorly adapted. So they will use all the technology of genetics and cyborgs to adapt themselves. And if they go electronic, then they won't need a gravitational field anymore, They won't need an atmosphere, so they go into space, and if they're near immortal, they'll expand through the galaxy. So I think if we bear in mind that there's more time lying ahead than has elapsed up till now, and technology in future may lead to evolution on a far faster time scale, a technological time scale of a few centuries rather than thousands of centuries for Darwin, then of course it's completely mind-blowing what these future options might be. We just don't know. We have a hard job predicting 50 years ahead. And if I could say one final thing, a contrast between the past and the present, like the one I gave about the Black Death, it feels paradoxical that medieval cathedral builders laid bricks on a vast structure which took a century to finish and still inspires us nearly a millennium later, even though they thought an apocalypse would come within 1,000 years. Whereas now we have these vast horizons, but we don't plan more than 30 years ahead in general. The reason that's not quite such a paradox is, of course, that the medieval cathedral builders, they may have thought there might be an apocalypse, but they thought the lives of their children and their grandchildren would be the same as theirs. They thought there was no rapid change that was going to happen, whereas now we know not only about these vast horizons where completely unpredictable things could happen, but we know that the life of our children and grandchildren will be different from ours, and that's our only rather feeble excuse for not planning further ahead compared to our medieval forebears.